Hey friends, welcome to Yoga Off the Mat. I'm your host, Divya. Like anyone else with a heart, I've watched as the IOF blatantly commits unconscionable war crimes which violate international humanitarian law against the innocent civilians of Palestine since the Nakba, the Arabic word for catastrophe, in 1948, but truly going back far, far beyond that. This modern-day genocide has opened all of our eyes to the stomach-turning reality faced by the people of Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Eelam Tamil, and so many other communities of the global south, due to the lasting edicts of imperialistic greed and enforced by the oppressive powers that be. Additionally, we're also waking up to the interconnectedness between all of that and the ongoing struggle against systemic violence against Black and Brown communities in the West. There are many people far more qualified than myself who have summarized these histories and provided critical analysis to help you separate truth from propaganda. I've compiled some resources from credible journalists and activists in this space and linked them down in the description so you can continue your education. In this episode, I hope to accomplish three things. First, I'll break down the yogic concept of ahimsa, or nonviolence, and share the subtlety of its true meaning versus the popular interpretations. We'll also explore the different types of himsa, or violence, and how we're seeing them play out, unchecked, in real time. Second, I'll illuminate why labeling crimes such as genocide, ethnic cleansing, oppression, neo-imperialism, using neutral terms like conflict, quote unquote, absolves them of their dependence on violence, and how failing to hold responsible parties accountable for their violations against humanity is decidedly anti-yoga. Third, I'll help you craft a plan to engage in the global liberation movement using yogic tools and practices in a way that feels authentic to you. I encourage you to really sit with the concepts that I talk about today, some of which may be quite difficult to contend with, by keeping an open mind and heart if you feel triggered, taking notes on what stands out to you, and using the journal prompts that I include at the end to reflect on what you learned. I've included a list of academic and media references for you in the episode description so that you can dive deeper into any of the topics that I discussed today. This podcast is a space for all of us to learn and grow, so let's do just that. Ahimsa is the first principle of Yama, the code of ethics and morals. Yoga philosophy asks us to apply these codes in the external world, but also in our internal world. Yama is the first of 8 limbs in Ashtanga Yoga. If you haven't already, I encourage you to listen to episode 2 and get the Cliff's Notes of what Ashtanga Yoga consists of. Ask anyone to define Ahimsa and they'll probably say nonviolence. They might associate it with the core values of the hippie movement. They may personify it through people like Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr., who popularized the idea of peaceful resistance. Or maybe they'll juxtapose college students staging a sit-in with a violent mob instigating a riot, highlighting 2 different approaches that are both catalysts of some kind of change in their own right. None of these interpretations of ahimsa are wrong, but they are just that, interpretations. When we consider the concept of ahimsa, we're usually focusing on the lack of something rather than the presence of something else. And thinking of anything from a perspective of lack is incredibly limiting. So why do we box ourselves in when it comes to the applied action of ahimsa? In order to deepen our understanding of ahimsa, let's first dive deeper into the definition of its inverse, himsa, meaning violence. Consider this. Is someone whose command triggers an airstrike against innocent people more or less violent than someone across the world who watches it on a screen but does nothing to try and resist or fight back against the forces that make that possible? Maybe that was too easy. Let me complicate it a little bit more. What if a gardener squashes an invasive insect that's known to destroy fruit-bearing trees? Is the gardener the perpetrator or the preventer of harm in this case? There's no right answer here, and if there is, I'm certainly not the authority. I just want you to observe the variance in how we perceive reality. Keeping this in mind, here are the 4 types of ahimsa, again, violence, as outlined in Jainism, a religion which is known for its emphasis on peace. Virodhi is violence arising from defending oneself. Udyogi is violence resulting from one's occupation. Arambi is violence that arises from our daily duties. And sankalpi is intentional violence. Sankalpi is the most common way that we perceive violence in the modern day. It's rooted in a desire to cause pain, harm, suffering, or even to disadvantage others, just to name a few ways. All 4 types of himsa can be committed by thoughts, words, and actions. But for the sake of today's conversation, we'll focus primarily on the application of Sankalpi himsa, intentional violence, and evaluate how it's used to facilitate systemic harm in the present day. So to even begin to understand what systemic harm is, we need to think about what natural harm is. Well, given everything that we've learned about himsa, I believe it boils down to intentionality. We observe violence in nature all the time. We see a certain hierarchy in the animal kingdom, upheld through violence, but we choose to perceive it as cruel and merciless when really it's just natural order. A lion does not kill a gazelle to cause it suffering or to deny it resources. A lion kills a gazelle to sustain itself, its cubs, and its pride. The same goes for a giraffe eating leaves or a bird eating a worm. When we as humans decided to create an order amongst ourselves, it wasn't done for survival. It wasn't a natural instinct, the way it is in the animal kingdom. It's a self-serving construct intentionally manufactured to benefit some and disadvantage others. This kind of violence starts in the mind. The only way to create an order like this is to dehumanize, devalue, and disrespect others with your thoughts to such a degree that it leads to violence in speech. And as one voice speaks out, others join in, and before you know it, this violence has spread around like a disease. And with enough time, this incites enough confidence to begin to see those words turn into actions. This is when humans choose to use Sankalpi himsa, intentional violence, to enforce these orders. Now that we know that violence can originate from our thoughts, this changes the context of ahimsa even further. So let's return to ahimsa from a yogic lens. How does it work? Within the context of yoga philosophy, we now know it's both reasonable to interpret ahimsa as an inverse of violence, but also that this does not necessarily make it passive either. Our actions can be well-intentioned and non-violent. But what happens if we don't challenge our thoughts alongside that? What happens if we lead with our words, but our actions don't follow suit? This is why performative activism doesn't really work and is rarely sustainable. When it comes to disrupting systemic violence, without a genuine reconstruction of our belief systems, we cannot truly change our pattern of behavior to become better aligned with ahimsa. Take Black Lives Matter, for instance. Following the palpable rise in awareness of systemic oppression after the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor in 2020, we saw people all over the world post a black square on social media in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. Resources were shared, DE&I consultants were hired, and Black businesses experienced a momentary boost in sales. For many of those businesses, that performative allyship ended up doing more damage than good. Yoga scholar Shyam Ranganathan says in his book, Yoga, Anticolonial Philosophy, ahimsa is radically procedural. It is about acting in ways that depart from systemic harm. I couldn't agree more. In the context of the current genocide against Palestinians, there continues to be merciless violence against the innocent civilians, in addition to the withholding of relief rations, food, water, medical supplies, safe harbor from attacks, and a total denial of basic human rights. A key step in dismantling systemic harm is also calling it what it is. Dancing around reality by calling something like genocide a conflict, quote unquote, makes it much harder to find the right course of action to restore peace and justice when it's being stripped away. Another important element of ahimsa is expanding our capacity for love and understanding of one another. We can extend more grace to our peers as they make mistakes along their path of learning and growth. And same goes for ourselves. We can also be loving when we hold each other accountable for that growth. In the months following October 7th of 2023, millions of ordinary citizens like you and I, all around the world, banded together to appeal to our governments to divest from the IOF and many other institutions that are empowering the genocide of Palestinians. Through our calls, protests, letters, fundraisers, town halls, sit-ins, and more, we are calling for change. We're putting ahimsa into action by changing the narrative and leading with peace. Brave college students at Columbia University in New York City staged a sit-in solidarity with Palestine. acknowledging their suffering and refusing to sit by quietly without speaking up and demanding that the institution divest. The students were peaceful, expressing themselves through song and dance, art, poetry, chanting, yet their very presence seemed to be perceived as threatening, to the point that actual violence was used to throttle their progress towards peace. Yet we are still further along the path of Ahimsa now than we would be if we sat by and did nothing. Again, I want to be clear in stating that Ahimsa is not simply accomplished by not perpetuating violence. Practicing Ahimsa is actively disrupting systems of harm and putting forth new opportunities for peace. So how can we do this? If you made it this far in the episode, I commend you for taking the time to open your mind and think differently. Here are a few ideas on how you can engage in the global liberation movement in a way that's authentic to you. Education is the foundation for change, and there are many ways that we can approach this. Join a book club and exchange ideas with people who are not only like-minded, but also who come from different backgrounds and hold different perspectives to yours. See what you can learn from them or what you could teach them about what you think. Volunteer your skills to an organization that's doing relief work. Maybe you can design a poster or write an article, make calls to gather donations, or offer to coordinate outreach for a community event. Call your local politicians and encourage them to support a ceasefire. Make art, write poetry, and share your resources with your community however it feels authentic to you. Say a prayer for the innocent lives lost. This is also an act of Ahimsa. Remember, Ahimsa is up to you. It's how you want to practice the most important value that yoga teaches us. How to be in better unity with ourselves and the world around us. In unity, there is no oppression, there is no hatred, there is no ego. There is only love, respect, and compassion. When we amplify the power of Ahimsa, very much an active force, we get closer to a future where all beings are free. Protest is Ahimsa. Medical care is Ahimsa. Safe harbor is Ahimsa. Resistance is Ahimsa. Ceasefire is Ahimsa. Here are some journal prompts to help you reflect. 1. Think about something that you love to do, something that brings out your most loving self. Can you connect this skill to a community need or an opportunity to give back to someone who may need it? Use the suggestions that I shared earlier as a guideline. 2. What does peace mean to you? What small change can you make in the way that you think, speak, and act in your everyday life that can enhance a sense of peacefulness? If this episode resonated with you and you'd like to take action, you can find links in the episode description to help you get started. If you enjoyed this episode and look forward to more, consider supporting my work by joining my Patreon, patreon.com/Divya Bala. And make sure you follow Yoga Off the Mat on your podcast platform of choice. At Yoga Off the Mat Podcast on Instagram, at Divya Bala on YouTube. Thanks for listening. It's time to get off your mat and do some yoga.